This little section is called Dodging the U.S. Marshal. Okay. It was at this time that the so-called raids on polygamists began. The Edmund Bill, so called for the senator from Kentucky who introduced it, was passed in 1882. The law, however, was not enforced with respect to the offenses against polygamy until the latter part of the year 1884, when it was directed against the Mormons. United States Marshals were sent to Utah to search out the men who had more than one wife. This was the beginning of a period of stress for Watson and both his families, for no distinction was made by the officers between those whose plural marriage had taken place before the law was enacted and those who were subsequently married to more than one wife later. Like other Mormons married prior to the law, Lorenzo Dow felt that he could not renounce the principle of plural marriage and disregard his responsibility to his second wife and their children, and so he lived in constant danger of apprehension. Within a few months after these raids started, Watson was forced to keep away from home to avoid arrest. So it was decided by him and both his wives that it was necessary for one of Lissy's girls to go live with Emily. Emily's oldest girl, Tallulah, had died the year before, and she had but two small ones now. Hired help had been frightened by the U.S. Marshals, so they wouldn't stay at nights. Pearl, Lissy's 8-year-old girl, was the one decided upon to go. Her mother was to make all her clothes, as Emily had done very little sewing, and Emily was to have full charge of her other wives. Pearl was so tender-headed, and no doubt more tender-hearted, that she had to go to her mother each day for about an hour to get her long yellow hair brushed, combed, and braided. Her tresses hung about a foot below her waist. After tears were kissed away, she went back willingly to help care for the little ones whom she loved dearly. Pearl lived with Emily for 13 years, lacking just a few months, remaining there until she was married December 10th, 1897. She had postponed her marriage from June until December on account of the birth of Emily's daughter, Afton, born 7 months after her father's death. When the notice of Pearl's marriage came out in the county paper and reported that she was the daughter of Sarah Melissa Clark and L.D. Watson, several told Emily that it was too bad that a mistake had been made in naming Pearl's mother. Most people thought that she was Emily's daughter. Sometime during the latter part of this year, there's a little section. Let me just, I can't wait. I'm sure I won't be able to find it. Wait, right there. Never mind, I can't go. Okay, so in the Lyman book, there's a book that Pearl wrote about her and her husband. There's a lot to do with, there's a little to do. There's something to say about what she had in that arrangement of being at her dad's, kind of growing up at her dad's second wife's home. So, anyway, there's some part in her book called Lyman, the Lyman book. Pearl and George, their story, something like that. And so it's really good. And she has some of her children. So Pearl, some of her children and people wrote in. I mean, they picked their children put together her book after. Yeah, she had written a lot of stuff and then put it together. So anyway, yeah, refer to that. You'll love it. Okay. Okay. Sometime during the latter part of this year in 1885, a supposedly good friend, William Orton, sent a note to Lissy stating that he had just finished an upstairs room over King's drugstore and that it had an outside entrance. He would be glad to have Watson and the other men then dodging the U.S. Marshals use it for their sleeping quarters. So Watson and a brother-in-law, Edward M. Dalton, took their bedrolls and slept in the room for 2 nights. The third night, Watson had just lain down when he heard heavy steps coming up the stairs and a sound as if something heavy were being dragged. It was very dark. Watson raised up, and as he did so, there was a sound as if a heavy object was thrown on the floor by Dalton's bedroll. Watson felt the power of Satan so strong that he commanded the evil emissary to leave, whereupon there was a heinous laugh. He then commanded it to leave in the name of Jesus Christ. The sound of steps then went down the stairs as heavy as they had come up. He lit a match to see the heavy object that had been left, but there was nothing at all. Then he arose, dressed rapidly, took his bedroll, and left to find Dalton and Peter Wimmer. Other men who were going to room there, and he told them not to go. He felt sure something was going to happen. The next morning before daylight, Hannah Taylor Orton, whose home was but a few rods away, was awakened by a loud cursing of the disappointed deputy U.S. Marshal as they came down the stairs of the room above the drugstore. That same fall, 2 marshals lay out on a pole fence, partially hidden by plum bushes, for they had word that Watson was at Lissy's. And they desired to catch him at Emily's. Before daylight, because they were chilled to the bone from a heavy hailstorm, they made a raid on Lissy's home. Before she let them in, she helped her oldest daughter out a back window that was covered partway up by a dirt cellar, and the child made her way to Emily's and warned her father, who made his escape. No doubt the fierce storm and the intoxication of the marshals had kept them from seeing Watson go to Emily's in the midnight hours. Edward M. Dalton was arrested by the same good citizen who had planned the former trap, and he was so pleased with his success that he left Dalton in the charge of the city marshal Richard H. Benson, called Heber, while he went to the telegraph office to let his superior officers at Beaver know of his good luck. The prisoner, a fine, manly fellow, over 200 pounds, was noted not only for strength and courage, but for activity and swiftness in running. As the shades of evening fell, and Orton delayed his coming, Dalton remarked jocularly to Benson that he wished the deputy would leave, as he intended to escape, and he did not wish to get the city marshal into any trouble. He added with a smile that if Orton did not come soon, he had been gone more than an hour. He would have to leave anyhow. Suiting the action to the word, he adroitly slipped off his boots, gave Benson a sudden slap on the shoulder, bade him good night, and was off as on the wings of the wind. Benson, who was also fleet of foot, gave chase, but could not overtake the fugitive, who soon disappeared in the darkness. Now, you can reference that in the History of Utah, O.F. Whitney, Volume 3, page 525. Several townspeople who saw the getaway stated that Dalton, after running 1/2 block, jumped a high picket fence that surrounded the central square, and Benson couldn't make it. Soon after this, Dalton left town and went into Arizona and assisted in a mail contract for nearly a year. This was the second time that Dalton had slipped away from the marshals, and twice that Watson had sprung the traps set for him and made his escape, which made the U.S. Marshal angry. They had been heard to say they would get those 2 men dead or alive, and this indictment was only for a misdemeanor and not for a crime. Thus the crusade went on with unabated rigor. Arrests were going on not only in Utah but in Arizona and Idaho. Being unable to get Watson, Dalton, and Wimmer for trial in the Second Judicial Court, indictments were made out for the arrests of their plural wives, Emily Crane, Delilah Clark, and Sarah Hewlett. These women were arrested in the late afternoon of December 12, 1885. Emily was 6 months in pregnancy. Delilah had a nursing baby. Oh, I forgot that Emily Crane was... Okay, yeah. Good. Emily was 6 months in pregnancy, and Delilah had a nursing baby 4 months old. These 3 were placed in an open buggy, or buckboard, as they called. 3 citizens were deputized to guard on horseback, while Deputy Marshal William Thompson went to wire Beaver his good fortune. These horseback deputies were George Warren, Sidney Burton Jr., and Will Curtis, all of Parowan. After taking Emily's 2 little ones and her sister Delilah's little boy to her home to care for until their mother's return, Lissy went back to the buckboard and told the guards that they should be humane enough to get blankets to wrap around the women. Snow was on the ground and it was bitter cold. George Hobbs, a bystander and neighbor, left and returned with blankets. Lissy had been heating rocks in her fireplace, and when the other deputy marshal arrived, had him help her wrap them in paper and burlap and place at the women's feet. Then this deputy, John Armstrong, when this deputy, John Armstrong, saw the 10 children, as Lissy had 7 of her own, around the supper table, the older ones trying to quiet and feed the younger, he said, "I will never have anything to do with this kind of business again." And he was true to his word. These women were taken to Beaver, arriving there between 2 and 3 o'clock the next morning. Taken to the Hutchings Hotel, they were given hot milk and bread. They remained there under strict guard until 10 o'clock, when they were taken to the county courthouse. Each one was placed under a $500 bond by Judge Borman, who appeared in March as witness for the conviction of her husband. Then the second judicial court would set. The deputy marshal felt confident that they would capture the 3 men by then. The court for the Southern District held its sessions at Beaver City, Utah. Some of the outlying districts were more than 100 miles from the judicial center. A regular corps of deputy marshals scoured the country in quest of polygamists because of the remuneration it would bring. Men and their wives were taken to Beaver, where many of them were strangers. These had no opportunity to provide themselves with assistance, and they had to either give bond or go to jail. The court required that only those of well-known ability to meet financial obligations were accepted as bondsmen. Fayette Shepherd and John R. Murdoch's financial standing in Beaver were first class, and they were ever ready to render every possible assistance to their unfortunate brethren. So they went the bonds of 50 or more different men. Nor was this legal and financial assistance the only expression of their kind-hearted sympathy toward those in distress. The hospitality of their homes was a source of comfort and consolation to many. These 2 men went the bonds for the 3 women mentioned, and these women were sent back to Parowan that day. One of the young boys of Parowan had been deputized and had driven a buckboard over, and he now drove them back. When they were ready to leave, they found that Deputy Marshal Gleason was accompanying them, trying to spring some sort of surprise as usual. Upon arriving in Paragouna, Emily's headache was so severe that she had them stop at the McBride Hotel and order her a cup of tea. While it was being made, she slipped an already prepared note into the hands of the messenger, an old friend, telling him to send a horseman to Parowan at once to inform her husband that a deputy was returning with them. The friend's son, Billy McBride, mounted a horse and rode the 5 miles and delivered the warning. Again, the marshal was disappointed. September 25th, 1885. Order of the Court. Whereas E.A. Ireland, United States Marshal, has this day presented to this court an account for extraordinary expenses incurred in the hiring of a posse to assist in the arrest of witnesses in case court, the United States versus E.M. Dalton, Peter Wimmer, and L.D. Watson, charged each with unlawful cohabitation, whereas the charged in said account appear to be just and according to law. It is hereby ordered that said account amounting to the sum of $300 be, and the sum is hereby approved. Copied from the Minute Book, 1883 through 1886, page 552, Alma W. McGregor. For over 4 years now, the most drastic measures had been taken to imprison every man within the territory who acknowledged or sustained more than one wife. The courts allowed the widest scope to be given to the interpretation of the law, which was aimed exclusively at the Mormon people. U.S. deputy marshals were sent throughout Utah to arrest all men living in polygamy, whether they had gone into plural marriage before or after the law was passed. This caused many to move their families into Old Mexico or Canada. Others went into hiding in different places, which forced them to neglect their families. Watson had no intention of neglecting his and he had very strong feelings about the authorities dragging Emily back to court in March to testify against him. He had said time repeatedly that no wife of his should be dragged into court while they tried to get incriminating evidence against him. There would be no Belle Harris case in his family. When asked by his daughter what he meant, he said that Belle Harris was a second wife of Brother Nelson of Monroe. She was arrested and taken to the Second Judicial Court in Beaver with a nursing baby on her lap. Because she refused to answer questions, she was sent to the Utah State Penitentiary. All the questions asked her were aimed against her virtue. Of course, they little knew or cared that the Latter-day Saint Church enjoined upon its members the strictest chastity, and they were taught to defend virtue with their lives. In Watson's eyes, Emily was as much his wife as was Lissy. She was given to him by the same authority and sanctioned by the church. The law was, and still is, that a wife cannot testify against her husband, but the courts didn't acknowledge her a wife, so they intended to use her as a witness against Watson. To prevent this, when court convened in March, Watson appeared in his own defense. He returned to his home in Parowan and was at Emily's bedside when she gave birth to a son, March 15th. He blessed and named the baby Ralph Pendexter Watson. This record is found in Watson's own handwriting, in a small record book in the family's possession. Watson had appeared in court in Beaver on the 25th day of the month. He had been indicted on 3 counts. He was tried on unlawful cohabitation, and the other 2 were dismissed. The defendant supplied the testimony by going upon the stand himself, acknowledging his wives in that relation, and admitted that he had lived with them. He was sentenced by Judge J.S. Borman. March 25th, 1886, to the Utah Penitentiary for a term of 6 months. Fine and cost of the court was $300. He was turned over to the U.S. Marshal E.A. Ireland to be taken to Salt Lake City. Okay, and then, I'm almost done the picture. The next section is the Utah State Penitentiary. And we'll read that next time. Okay, thanks, bye.